My name is Mary O'Riordan, and I came to this group via being on the mailing list of Yohai, who's a Brunel academic. And that dates back to sort of, I think, 2000, I was trying to remember it actually, 2016 or 17, when I did a small bit of teaching in Brunel. I used to teach a module that when I joined was called the Toxic 3.0, but we sort of revised the name on that. And it was essentially practice with social work practice with adults in relation to domestic abuse, mental health, and substance use. So that's how I came to receive the email and hear about this event. In my normal life, I'm an adult safeguarding lead or manager in an NHS commissioning organisation. So it's not front facing, should we say. It's around the commissioning arrangements, policies, procedures, strategy, investigations and inquiries and things for NHS commissioning in Northeast England. And then as my hobby, I am in hopefully the final stages writing up a doctorate of social work that I've been doing with the University of East London. So this has been very timely because it's exciting for me to try and put some shape on what my work has been and what I want the story of that to be. It might not be immediately obvious where the sort of philosophical leanings are or how relevant it is to this, but hopefully that will emerge in the next few minutes. The title is quite lengthy. My sort of working title is The Contribution of Safeguarding Adult Reviews to the Social Construction of Social Work in England. And I'll go through each part of that, though hopefully we'll all be clear on what social work in England is. I'm not sure if Aidan's still on the line. I've learned quite a bit actually already from today. I've also learned from Aidan about the expression whisk, which I'd not come across before. I've written it down, and therefore I shall self-declare that I'm also a whisk, I think. And I will say to Aidan, if you're listening, that whilst you might feel like you're in the global majority, I think being male in social work in Ireland probably wasn't that, wasn't part of the global majority. I think there's a lot of Marys and a lot of Sheilas in the staff room, so well done for persevering with that. Anyway, if we can bring up the next slide, and I'll just briefly introduce what I'm hoping to talk about. Is that working for us?
Can you see the next slide?
Can everyone else see the next slide?
No.
Oh.
I don't think you've got it on slideshow, Michael.
Okay. Let me try and get back.
I
think this is the issue that I do have every so often. Let me try again.
I mean, that's why I dodged the bullet on that, because I just absolutely hate it.
So let's see if I can get it onto slideshow now. From current slide, can you see it now?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wait a minute, it's now disappeared off. Wait. From current slideshow, resume the slideshow. Should be able to see it now. If we have the same problem, there is a solution, but it's not as the ideal one. But if you can see it and everybody else can, we can carry on for the moment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the slides are not, super interesting, so I can sort of plow on regardless. With the research, which I'll explain now in a minute, my main sort of interest was about social workers. I felt like a little bit of that, I suppose, I might speak to sort of Aidan's experience, was about the sort of training in one country, coming to work in another one, feeling like social work didn't have the same esteem as I had thought it might have, and becoming very interested in how social workers understand their role, how they make sense of themselves as professionals, what that looks like, and on one level, the influence of inquiries around this. So a lot of sort of media reporting around social work, more so on the sort of children's social work side, some very high profile stories that we'll all be very familiar with, going back to sort of Victoria Klimbay and Baby P, that sort of vilified social workers. And I guess my thinking was, how can you get up in the morning and go to work knowing that that's what is being said about you, or that's what the public think of you? So that's been my research interest. As I work in adult safeguarding, once I left sort of frontline practice and went to work in the commissioning organisation, I became aware of a process called adults or safeguarding adult reviews. I'd never heard of them as a practitioner, which is in now that I look back on it kind of interesting. And essentially, it's a form of inquiry. It's when something has gone, thought to perhaps have gone wrong. It's a retrospective sort of look back on the services that were offered to an individual. It's thought to be kind of non-blaming, and the idea is to look at whether the safeguarding practices around that person might have worked better to protect them from harm or death, if that's what happened. And I guess I felt that safeguarding adult reviews, or a lot of people would feel this, carried quite a lot of power. Once a safeguarding adult review is commissioned, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, as with all inquiries, there's therefore a narrative then about what's happened. That becomes published. And there are recommendations and actions for agencies that arise from that. And in my role in commissioning in the NHS, it felt like those actions carried a lot of weight. If you wanted to make changes in any of our providers or in the way that services were run, an action arising from a safeguarding adult review carried a lot of power in the structure of how we sort of organise things. So I became quite interested in the whole positioning of power within the safeguarding adult reviews, what they're about. Essentially, they are one of the few snapshots of adult social care available. So there's not that much sort of contemporary evidence. When I had started my research, I'd been looking at court reports from the Court of Protection as a kind of a snapshot of stories of people's experience of adult social care and a kind of an artifact of our times. And I felt like safeguarding adult reviews are one of the few other forms of sort of evidence, shall we say, like case law in social work. And actually, in my time in Brunel, I had seen other staff using them or using inquiries, not necessarily safeguarding adult reviews, as a teaching tool. So there's something for me in about how inquiries set the sort of narrative about what social work is or what it could be. So I'm going to talk a bit about safeguarding adult reviews, my research questions, and then pause a bit on social constructionism, what variants of that and why. And then I'll talk briefly about the findings of the study and where it's going. But that, in a way, is almost less interesting, I guess, for me. The purpose is to sort of get everyone on board with the idea that applying a philosophical lens to inquiries around social work or to retrospective inquiries is very useful and tells us a lot about what's going on at the moment. Next slide, please.
Has it come up?
No.
Oh, right. I still must be doing the wrong thing then in that case. Let me just try something different. So maybe we'll have to do it like this. Does that now show the next slide?
Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think we're going to have to do it this way then in that case, just for now. Sorry about that.
That's all right. This is a bit like when you're on an airplane and the pilot gives you detail about what they're doing and you're like, I don't really understand. just want to eat the peanuts and get to the end. I like the tech part, just beyond me, you know. So I guess, I've said it 4 times about safeguarding adult reviews and what is a safeguarding adult review. So essentially, 2014, the CARE Act launched the idea that every local area should have their own safeguarding adults board who would have sort of strategic responsibility for partnership around safeguarding. So that would be police, health services, and local authorities. Safeguarding as a responsibility sits with local authorities, but everyone has responsibility in the arena, and local authorities do need help from a partnership support from police, health services, fire, housing departments. And so each local area has a safeguarding adults board. I'd never heard of that when I was a social worker, which I now find kind of interesting. And obviously in London, because of the way we are organised, there are therefore 32 safeguarding adult boards. But actually, a couple of them have merged, so I think 30 safeguarding adult boards. So in the event that an adult with care and support needs experiences significant neglect, harm, or even death, Members of the Safeguarding Adult Board can decide to conduct an independent review or inquiry into the circumstances of that person's life and their death. So that's separate to any kind of criminal proceedings. It's separate to any internal SIs or whatever each agency uses in it. It's a multi-agency review. The person doesn't have to have died, but very often that's what triggers it. There is a small, each Safeguarding Adults Board would have a committee that decides if something is worthy of a SAR investigation or not. And SARs, there are a certain number of criteria by which things automatically become a SAR. But by and large, there's quite a bit of discretion around whether something meets the criteria to be a safeguarding adult review or not. And then once that's been decided, an independent consultant is appointed. Now, I think Aidan said a few times that Ireland's a small place. In the arena of adult safeguarding, this is also a very small place. So you're talking about quite a small number of people. There might even be someone on the call today who have the sort of skill set and the experience deemed necessary to conduct an safeguarding adult investigation. So like we're 20, 30, it's very small numbers. I interviewed about 13 of them for my thesis, which has kind of shot me in the foot because there's not really anyone left to examine it now. So this is where things are at. And these will all be people with considerable experience of working in the field, but very few continue to practice, as most are social workers, some are ex-police officers. And their role is to work with specific methodologies to bring people together to investigate around the circumstances of that person's life and their story and what happened, and then produce a report which is published and freely available, and ideally has some recommendations for practice. So if you bring up the next slide, I'll talk about an example from Hackney, where I work. This is a guy who the report is published under the name MS, and he had been sort of known to services in Hackney on and off for about 30 years. He died at the age of 63. He was Turkish and identified as being Kurdish, and there's lots of involvement with services around homelessness, self-neglect. And sadly, he was found dead at a bus stop in Stoke Newington, where he'd been living for like quite a few nights before he passed away. Members of the public had been sort of complaining about it and raising concerns about him. And he's a really interesting character. One of the things about him was that he'd previously been in a nursing home and had argued his case and then left. And I always think that's it's quite interesting that anyone would ever be able to get out of a nursing home once they are placed in one. So there was a coroner's investigation into the causes of his death and everything, but the Safeguarding Adult Review was really looking at how it came to be that so many services were involved with him, and yet this was how he died. And there was lots of hefty language in the report about professionals lacking curiosity, about having the skills and training to work with someone with his sort of complex needs. Quite a bit of focus on language and interpretation, and I'd say on balance quite critical of the practitioners involved, and whether that was fair or unfair, I mean, that is essentially a snapshot of social work in Hackney that is fairly critical and quite grim to read. So can I have the next slide, please? So my research questions were, what are the identifiable narratives about social work practice within SARS? What are these reports saying about social workers? How do social workers perceive the work of SARS? Are they aware of them? What do they make of them? Are they intimidated by SARS? Do they think that they are a welcome addition to developing our practice and our knowledge base? And then the thorny question, which I've put in grey, is about the impact of SARS on the development and frontline practice. They are very heavily resourced. They carry a lot of weight within organisations. In my own work, I have to, my quarterly report has to include a sort of a SAR update. So there is, they carry a bit of authority within the system, but are they sort of having an impact, or what's the sense of the impact around them? Next slide, please. From the outset, I felt very heavily immersed, lots of bias, lots of hypothesis, fair bit of rage. I just didn't really feel very separate in any way to take this on. And so it needed to have a solid theoretical grounding and some kind of perspective outside of my own bias. And it landed very quickly on social constructionism. I think, well, partly because the first task in this was to read about 50 safeguarding adult reviews. And so thinking about the language that were used in them, some of my own experiences about being part of sort of of commissioning these and the implementation. So there was a brief example of another lady in Hackney called Jojo who had a chronically untreated skin condition. It was really very grim. Her family, she was living at home with her family, and they were struggling a lot. And she went to a routine hospital appointment and sort of died on her way in the waiting room whilst waiting. So there was lots of questions about whether she'd had, what caused her to die. Did she have an underlying heart condition or whatever? And one of the things that came out in the review was that a GP had called to her house the night before she had gone to hospital. And so immediately there was questions about, well, did the GP see anything? Should they have phoned an ambulance? How did the GP think she was fine at 4 o'clock on Friday and then she was dead at 2 o'clock on Saturday? And we had lots of conversations about this, spoke to the Medical Defence Union, spoke to our legal department about the ins and outs of this GP's visit. And I write about this a little bit in my thesis about how the initial conversation was that the GP had called to the house, which feels very sort of friendly, as if the GP was sort of on their way home and just popped in. And then in the next revision of the draft sort of document, the author revised that to say that the GP had visited to assess. And so that kind of immediately sort of shifts the language a little bit more purposefully, like that the GP had a role to be there, and we then have to explore whether they had fulfilled that role or not. When the draft of the report was ready, I and with another colleague had to bring it to the GP and say, look, this has emerged. We need to sort of account for why when you visited the night before, you didn't do any physical observations and you didn't sort of think that this person was at risk in any way. And she then got very upset and started crying and said, well, I didn't do physical observations because the patient was kicking, screaming, hitting me, spitting at her mum. And in my clinical view, I think if someone can do all that, then they're probably, that their heart and lungs are working quite well. And I didn't want to distress them, but I also didn't want to put that in my clinical notes because essentially that was, my last contact with them. And I didn't really want to, I just didn't think it was relevant. Which sort of immediately changes the whole sort of structure, the whole essence of that interaction. And so then we sort of went back to the report again. This is an independent reviewer, and said, look, I think we need to be a bit softer in our language and kinder towards this GP who's now on the brink of leaving this profession because they feel so persecuted and they feel like this inquiry has come to get them. And the reviewer changed the language to something along the lines of the GP had gained access and used to the property by permission of the person's mother. It made it extremely formal, extremely legalistic. And it, again, didn't quite capture for me the intention, the interaction, the sort of clinical decision-making about why physical observations hadn't happened or whatever. So in a sense, it's all of that about language, about practitioners having to justify their decision-making, which is often in very busy and less than ideal circumstances. It's about the role of somebody who's quite senior and quite separate from practice, appraising that and reviewing it, and then recording it in a way that becomes an evidence base for what social work, well, in this case, it was about GPs. I sort of use that example purposefully, but about what sort of health and social care practitioners do, what they should do, and what the gaps are in between that. So I just said there that I chose social constructionism because it fits with my perspective. It felt very easy in my mind. I don't find philosophy that easy, to be honest. And so it felt very comfortable using social constructionism, fits with a lot of social work theories around certain narrative approaches. And also it helps in unpicking the sort of the two big questions here, the epistemological and the ontological issues, which is how SARS create a knowledge about what social work is, and then also what that knowledge actually is. And ultimately, I felt unable to sidestep the power play in all of these processes. So, next slide. I've left myself no time to talk about what I found, which is probably helpful. They might not be very interesting. So essentially, the methods are that I read about 50 of these reports. I did 2 focus groups with frontline practitioners that didn't feel very fruitful. So I started to do interviews with social workers. And then it came to me quite late in the project that actually I should interview the SAR authors as well and almost kind of triangulate the data. So I spoke to social workers, I spoke to SAR authors, and then I spoke to people in roles like mine who are required to implement the learning from SARS and who do the kind of meaty work around this. Can I have the next slide? So when I looked at, brought all the data together, there's a lot of very predictable sort of early themes or codes or findings. Obviously, the SAR reports speak a lot about failings, learning and development. Lots of people talk about the system. Every single person, every single report used the word, spoke about change. A lot of the sort of conversations seem to oscillate around the certainty that change was needed, which is also quite confusing in some respects because a lot of them also rely heavily on training as a recommendation. So in a sense, you're saying 2 things. On the one hand, you're saying the system is fine, it's just that practitioners need to be better at what they're doing. And then on the other hand, you're saying actually practitioners, I've lost my train of thought there. Anyway, there's as I went through it, I found quite a few sort of contradictions between what the reports were saying and what people were saying about them. So in applying social constructionism, I'm sort of deconstructing what the SARS are saying. Quite a bit about justice, human rights, and that was more so from the SAR authors, honouring the individual, honouring the story of their suffering. The social workers themselves weren't as cynical about SARS as I thought they might be, and they spoke a lot about being part of a transparent organisation, learning and development. But obviously they also had concerns about how nuanced these investigations would be and quite a lot of fear about blame. If you go to the next slide. Just to kind of, because it became quite a large data set, so just to sort of manage the data, I looked at some of those themes felt more like topic summaries, but I looked at how they fell within each of the different cohorts and what were the strongest kind of most dominant themes in each cohort. So I sort of covered that just now, but social workers in the focus group spoke a lot about learning and development and concerns about nuance. In one-to-one interviews, they spoke about that they would be afraid of inquiries if they worked in an organisation without supportive management. And so there's a real clear relationship between transparency and supportive management. And then, what I found quite interesting was the middle cohort, the safeguarding leads, who felt very concerned about the perceptions of social work held by others. And in their role of having to bring learning and development from SARS, were very concerned that they might be persecuting social workers, adding more strain, diminishing, by bringing negative content, that would in some way be affecting social workers' confidence in their role. So there was a weight of responsibility for them in shaping how these SARS are being used. If you want to go to the next slide, I realise this is actually quite fast, a bit fast-paced. So, a weird black box there. So I guess the deconstructing the messages around SARS felt fairly straightforward. really interesting talking to the SAR authors, very quickly unpicking for them the real desire for them around doing this kind of work, what they hope to achieve. I speak a bit in the write-up about grandparents' wisdom, SAR authors being looking like unfavorably on social work, saying, social workers aren't as maverick or as hard hitting as they might have been years ago, and we need to encourage them to be better advocates, and SARS as kind of an evidence base around that. And I speak a bit about what's being described, how good social work is described and how bad practice is described. And a lot of what is described as good social work is couched in language about things being heroic or people going above and beyond. People sort of agitating, stepping outside their job role. And I guess that sort of poses the question, like, is that what we think good social work is? Is good social work expected by definition to be sort of less boundaried? And I don't know. As a social work manager, that social work can be difficult to manage at times. And then bad social work as being social work that sort of does the job, that it does what they're being asked to do and perhaps doesn't agitate outside of their own team. And that was quite interesting. I'm mindful of time, and I think I've sort of run short, but the second part of the study then is looking about how the social workers sort of receive those messages and what they do with them, and the kind of confusion that lies within the idea. So the confusion that lies within the idea that SARS create the notion that things are preventable, that tragedy is preventable, and that a certain type of social work can prevent these kinds of difficult situations from arising. And just the weight of responsibility that kind of places on social workers, the sort of fear, the comments from them about how they're working in an environment of worrying that their cases might become decision making. There's lots of research around fear-based decision making or decision making in social work that worries about retribution. But essentially, my sort of final point was that I detected that there is within these SARs the power to construct a narrative of what social work is, and that narrative is that social work is lacking but has potential. And I think for incoming social workers, that kind of mismatch message is very daunting and quite debilitating. And there's not a great deal of surveillance. There's some sort of quality markers on what SARS could be, but that's sort of very limited. And I think there's definitely a role within this to be more defensive of the social work profession within these processes. So I'll stop there. I think I've gone on far too long. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Probably people would like to know what a SAR is. I probably haven't made that very clear.
Thanks, Mary. I think one of the things I picked up, which I was talking, I actually taught I've taught for the last 4 years, the module that you taught beforehand. Although when I took it over, it has become something very different, because we had to base it on the systematic review that came out by Skinner in 2000 that basically said toxic trio as a model, it has been debunked. It's got no evidence base, etc. So we've changed that quite a lot. But one of the things that really picked up on with toxic trio is that the use of that, like just that language, use of the language toxic trio, use of the language substance misuse, and I think this came through quite strongly in what you were talking about, that these SARs, yeah, SCR is the children's version, is that use of language is pivotal in creating criticism, power imbalances, all of this kind of stuff. I think that was very that came through really clearly, and I think that's a way I haven't quite thought about these case reviews before.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and actually, they are sort of standalone. There's not many things like them, but there are domestic homicide reviews, which are inquiries into the death of someone in an intimate relationship. So when someone dies and the death is domestic abuse related, and one of the respondents in the study authors SARS and domestic homicide reviews. And she felt very strongly that domestic homicide reviews start from the position of a victim, rightly or wrongly, and work outwards from there. Whereas SARS, in her view, start from the position of services and service engagement, and really kind of set the tone as being, we're here to examine the services, which we think are probably fine, really. Maybe practitioners could be a bit more curious and people could be a bit more engaged, but actually we're sort of like, all right, rather than starting from the position of this person has died and what was their experience like. And yeah, I mean, like from the bus stop outwards sort of thing. Yeah, it's been interesting.
But I think the thing that really something home to me was your discussion about that, the way that the language was used and the language made people feel when the woman went to hospital and died, and the specific words that are used had such a powerful impact on the practitioners, and then people in relatively powerful positions. So the words that we use in everyday reports, case notes, reports about people that they read, reports about people's children, it just shows you how important that is. I think that was really, really, really good. It's something I was talking about, which is semiotics. I think is something very similar to what you were saying. So I thought that was great. I'm going to hand over though, Lisa. You popped your hand up, so I'm just going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Mary, for that. That was really interesting. And again, it's something because when I came to England, there was no discussion about SARS, but actually, the more and more I start to learn about them, there's a very much focus on what happened, but not why it happened, and not really looking critically about why it happened. And again, I think it was interesting that you picked up on the language about training and all that, and that's all the buzzwords. You see that and again, and that's the tick box. Or we're doing something about it. We're recommending training. No, we need to go deeper than that. What really happened here and why did it happen? And that really isn't discussed as far as I can see in the SARS. And I know other critics of SARS have said that. I also think as well, it was just an observation. I suppose for me, coming from radical feminist organisations back in the day in Ireland and then coming over here, and it was all very much perfunctory, just do what the process says, do what the policy does, and this kind of heroic practice. Well, that would have just been normal practice back in the day, because there was just now this is my own perception, and I know I don't want to make a sweeping generalisation because I know that's not always the case, but it was this largely just do social work. It's social work by numbers. You follow the policy, you follow the procedure, recommended case notes, or just bullet point. Don't talk about, as you said, the description of actually what happened in that room. And again, the dumbing down nearly of the practice, I found that quite shocking when I came here. And again, that whole thing of like empowerment and support in social work, it was just about risk assess. That's all it's about. Do that, and don't ask the deeper questions. And I suppose when I see what Aidan was talking about, and I suppose the doctor who presented the doctor who's presented on philosophy and ethics, I really like that. It's really asking the question why. Why do we do what we do? So yeah, I just thought your presentation was amazing. Sorry, I'll shut up now. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading your report. And again, well done, Aidan. Keep up the good fight. It is, the thing is, my understanding of the whole thing of social work is pushing back against the system. That is, I suppose, part of our role. It's not just to accept things as they are. It's to push against it and ask for better for our communities. We're in service to our community, so we have a role to play as strong advocates for our communities. And I saw that when I came to England in practice here, what was being taught, like that was really gone. But I know that it's there. I know it's there. But yeah, thank you again, Mary. Really appreciate it. And thanks for today as well. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. Are there any more questions, comments before we wrap everything up?